As expected, the Heat stood pat at the NBA trade deadline, either unable or unwilling to find a player that might significantly improve their chances at a title this season. But with a flurry of moves around the Eastern Conference, was that the right decision? We break down what trades took place and if Miami is taking a big risk by not getting anything done at the NBA trade deadline on a special live episode of Locked On Heat.
You are Locked On Heat, your daily Miami Heat podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome to Locked On Heat, your daily podcast on the Miami Heat. I'm Wes Goldberg, editor at allyoucaneat.com. Joining me as always, it's longtime NBA reporter David Ramil. However you're tuning in, YouTube, Odyssey, or your favorite podcast app, or if you're joining us live after the trade deadline, thanks so much for making Locked On Heat your first listen every day. Well, it is 3:08 p.m. Eastern time, David, right after the 3 p.m. trade deadline. The Miami Heat, a quiet day for them. Does not appear that they have made a move. We talked about so many different options going into today, but you and I don't think if we had to bet on it, I don't think we would have bet on a move being made. But your takeaway from Miami not making a move today.
I can see why some fans are a little disappointed, but I think it was also, you have to temper those expectations and be a little more realistic. You weren't going to get a significant upgrade over Tyler. You weren't going to get a significant upgrade over Caleb Martin, and anything else would have been acquiring a small role player that probably wouldn't have garnered a significant amount of playing time in Eric Spoelstra's rotation. And so if you look at it from that perspective, what's the point? Like, they could have made a move that would have been either viewed as a lateral move at best, or maybe even a downgrade at worst. And that's much more realistic, that latter option. So to me, I'm not surprised by it. I think their team has as good a chance of any. And I've said this before, and I'll say this again. I've said this for years now. This team is only measured by what they accomplish in the postseason. And yes, the road there is going to be ugly. It's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be fun. But they can get to the postseason and they can make noise. Despite what moves Milwaukee made, despite whatever the Knicks and the Celtics have done, Miami is still a dangerous team in the Eastern Conference. They might not be good enough to win a title, but at the very least, they are good enough to advance deep into the playoffs. They might not make it, and I think that's also a realistic possibility. But you have to take that into consideration, is that you can't just trade away Tyler's $25 million salary and expect to get a superstar. That's not going to happen. And I think Miami probably was prudent, maybe a little too safe for my liking, but they were also prudent in saying, you know what, during the offseason, depending on what this team can do in the postseason, that's when we'll reassess and major moves will be made during the summer. I know that's not something that Heat fans want to hear.
No, it's fine. But you're right. You're right.
Yeah,
you're right. No, major moves. That stuff was always due for the summer. And by the way, let's not pretend that the Heat have not made a major move already. They traded Kyle Lowry and a first-round pick for Terry Rosier. That qualifies on this season based on this trade deadline. That qualifies as a major in-season trade, right? It is the biggest in-season trade the Heat have made since basically, I would say, the Goran Dragic trade. If you want to argue the Andre Iguodala, Jay Crowder kind of super multiplayer deal, maybe that one is in there too. Obviously, that one helped them get to the finals. But in terms of just a singular player, the Heat have not traded for a player like Rosier in quite a long time in the middle of a season. So they already made their major move. I do understand the want for maybe some minor moves on the fringes. You look at what the Celtics did, getting a guy like Xavier Tillman for a couple of second-round picks, and you do wonder why Miami couldn't do something like that. Now, what the reason is because Miami basically has 1.5 second-round picks that they could trade. They have an unprotected 2026 pick coming over from the Lakers via Cleveland that they have. That's really their only pick that doesn't come with protections. They have a couple of other ones that are conditional. They have one conditional pick. I think the 2024 second-round pick is conditional, protected, or it only conveys if it falls between 31 and 50-something, 55. Chances are that one would convey, but it's still conditional. So there's weird picks. They don't really have, and that's sort of my point here, they don't have all the stuff that these other teams have to trade to make those minor moves. It's kind of big swing or bust for Miami when you consider the assets that they have. They're not willing to trade those assets for lesser assets because they don't want to take a downgrade, right? They're not going to trade, for instance, Caleb Martin for a bundle of second-round picks that they can use later on this year, next year, or the year after that. They're not interested in downgrading the roster right now because they're most interested in trying to maximize this championship window and probably this one last year. So they're kind of going all in for this season. And then, like you said, they'll reevaluate in the summer. I don't know that you can evaluate the trade deadline based on, well, you couldn't get anybody that was going to factor into the rotation. I push back on that logic a little bit. I think there's something to be said about going and getting a guy who might not be in your night-to-night rotation but could be useful off the bench when you have basically already decided that Thomas Bryant ain't it if you're the Miami Heat. You've signaled that as much. He's out of the rotation, has been out of the rotation from basically the second week of the season. He hasn't played a whole lot regularly. Josh Richardson is fine as sort of this replacement pseudo ball handler, but I think with Drew Smith being hurt for the rest of the season, they could have went out and used sort of a break glass in case of emergency point guard. They didn't go out and make some big landmark point. They already got it. They got Rosier, but I think they could have used depth there. Depending on what happens with Haywood Highsmith and the car accident that he was involved in, and any sort of legal ramifications that may come out of that or not. There was no police report filed on that yet. We don't really know what the outcome of all of this is going to be or what the consequences might be, but maybe they could have used another forward. Now, I do want to get to some buyout options. That remains an option, and I think an important one for Miami. And I would actually we'll get to the buyout stuff later on. I think it's an important thing for us to cover. But, there's a difference when you're looking at the Eastern Conference and you see Milwaukee, Boston, Philadelphia, New York. I mean, New York's making major moves, but all these other, hey, they're gearing up, man. They're just like, hey, Xavier Tillman, just in case. And the Heat don't really have any just in case guys, unless they just maybe it's just that they trust their own guys.
That's exactly what it is. They put such a heavy premium on players that they've seen put in the work in-house. Not what we've heard, not even what we've seen around the league or anything like that. You come in here and you do the work, you'll earn a spot in their rotation. If you had said at the beginning of the season, you can have either Thomas Bryant as your center or Xavier Tillman, who's kind of undersized and not.
I would have picked Xavier Tillman.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't think it would have been. Now we're seeing Boston acquire Xavier Tillman, and there's all this, why didn't the Heat, throw in a couple of second rounders or trade Niko Jovic for Xavier Tillman? And it's like, I think
nobody of the right mind is saying they should have traded Jovic for Tillman.
You'd be surprised, but I think that's
right
what
mind.
fandom is. Yeah,
I said right mind.
That's what fandom does. The trade deadline makes craziness out of all of us,
But to your point, David, like Boston has a bunch of second-round picks that they could just throw at Xavier Tillman. If Miami were to use their 2 second-round picks, and again, it's sort of like 1.5 second-round picks, that's okay. Now you have no second-round picks. You went all in, quote unquote, on Xavier Tillman. And so that's Miami's mindset is if we're going to make a trade, it's going to be a big swing. And we don't really think that there's a big difference between your role players and our role players who we could develop in-house for free. And honestly, I'm fine with that mentality. I'm not sitting here.
It's worked.
It's worked. They find the role players who fit their scheme. What does Miami always tell you? You talk to Eric Spoelstra, you talk to the front office people, you talk to even some of the players in the locker room. We have a specific kind of player who works here. And we find and we develop them and we turn them into role players. And it's very sort of like Daryl Morey-esque also, where Daryl Morey is like, hey, if it's not a superstar, I'm really not all that interested in trading a bunch of stuff for him. He thinks role players are replaceable. And I think the Heat, they're like, it's not so much saying role players are replaceable, but it's we can make our own. We have the role players at home. We can kind of fashion these guys from nothing into something. We don't need to go out and spend assets on other role players. And so I think that's fine. Let's talk about Caleb Martin really quick. I think he was sort of the big one that if they were going to move sort of a major piece, that might have been the piece to move $6.8 million this year, player option for 7.1 next year, expected to opt out of that contract. He might be, and because of that, more than likely going to have to walk away in free agency to find that long-term lucrative deal that he wants. You and I talked a lot about Caleb Martin and what it would take to pry him away from Miami. Ultimately, the Heat decided, hey, this is our starting power forward now. We're going to keep this guy. There were other teams, contenders. I know the Sacramento Kings. You and I have talked a lot about Sacramento. Then it got more widely reported today and yesterday that the Kings were interested in Caleb Martin, kind of backing up what you and I have been saying for a couple of weeks now on here. Ultimately, that didn't happen. Your thoughts on Caleb Martin staying put?
I'm happy with it.
Same.
My expectations are that he'll find a way to contribute, just as he did. He's been rounding into form. He was injured for most of the start of the season. He's looked so much better of late, and he's going to provide a spark. Is it going to be an ultimate ceiling raiser? Probably not, but it helps Miami maintain the status quo, which has been higher than anybody else's in the Eastern Conference for the last 4 years. And that's the reality, is that you're not looking to look Caleb to be a 20-point per game scorer during the regular season, because you don't give a damn about the 82-game regular season. It's what happens in April when you're going against the Bucks or the Celtics or the Sixers or whomever you might face there. It's those opportunities that Caleb has found a way to shine during that makes him a special player. And again, it kind of reinforces the same thing. We know what we're getting in Caleb Martin. This is from the front office's perspective. Yeah. We've worked him. We've developed him. He's provided that spark. We know when he's not playing well, it's because of injury or something else. He's proven he's our guy. He, we're not for everybody, but he is for us, and that's why we want him. Unless you're going to trade somehow a $6.8 million player in Caleb Martin for a star level player that's going to raise your ceiling, there's no need to make that move, because you're just going to get it's going to be a lateral move or a downgrade, more than likely a downgrade. Like, who in the $6.8 million range is going to help Miami's chances of winning the next 20 out of 30 games? I don't see that player on the market.
More than Caleb, nobody that got traded today. Right. And so that was sort of the calculus Miami had to make. It's, even if we take a downgrade, is it worth it to us to take that downgrade now for a player who might be under contract longer? It could be a part of our rotation next year. Ultimately, the Heat have decided we like Caleb Martin. We want to keep Caleb Martin. And if he walks away, no problem. Look, they lost Max Strus and Gabe Vincent for nothing. That wasn't an L, because that was your starting backcourt for a finals run. That's a W. That's a W, buddy. And so if Caleb Martin is a major player for you in a playoff push, or if you think he can be, then he has more value to you now, even if he does walk away for nothing. I think fans kind of think too much. And even, I don't even mean blame fans. I think NBA media, like dorky salary cap, NBA Twitter, they're like, why would you let him go away for nothing? I don't know, because he's good right now and we still have some games to play. That's why. Right. And that's the ledger, really what Miami came down to.
They're looking at it from a ledger perspective. It has to balance on both sides. You want to end up in the black as opposed to the red, and that's how they see these transactions. But that's not how it is. It's not in a vacuum in a financial sense. It's an actual personnel level of play right now. And
I'm trying to win games right now. He helps us win games right now. Exactly. And nothing that we could trade him for is going to help us win games as much as Caleb Martin. Happy that he's sticking around. The Heat have won 4 of their last 5 games. Caleb Martin has been a big part of that.